I think that I've seen that you've studied not just sleep and PTSD, but autistic individuals, schizophrenics. And I'm wondering, I mean, you'll tell me what you'll tell me, but whether there's a lot of interest in doing this research, not just to understand these populations and their sleep behavior, which is, of course, tremendously valuable in its own right, but what light it also sheds on the more neurotypical brain.
You twisted that at the end. Okay. So I thought you were going to say, ask that we approach these studies with a different goal. And so I work on the autism and schizophrenia with a colleague and dear friend of mine, Dara Minoak, who works with those populations of schizophrenia patients and patients with autism. And from her perspective, she wants to cure them. She wants us to find, as we did, that their sleep-dependent memory processing is defective. And in the case of schizophrenia, it seems to be linked to a particular brain event that normally happens during sleep that doesn't happen nearly as much in patients with schizophrenia. And that the decrease in that particular type of brain event called the sleep spindle, because the EEG goes up and comes down and sort of looks like a spindle for all of your listeners who spin their own thread, that it was a deficit in that seems to be causing the deficit in memory consolidation across the night. And she's now working with pharma and with animal researchers to see if we can find drugs, perhaps, that can enhance those sleep spindles and get them back into a more neurotypical behavior, at least in terms of sleep-dependent memory processing. It's interesting with schizophrenia, all the worst symptoms, all the negative symptoms, the psychoses, the hallucinations, they have those pretty well under control now with medications. It's the cognitive deficits that still cripple them. And some of those are connected to failures at sleep-dependent memory consolidation. So I think from Dara's point of view, although she's in many ways a basic scientist, she's always focused on helping to ameliorate the symptoms in these populations. For me, it's more like you said, I view them as boundary conditions. Well, here's a possible. So we see in normals that the more sleep spindles a person has during the night, the more of these sleep events we see, the more they improve on this task or that task over the night of sleep. But the boundary condition is, what about people who get much, much less of them just because of who they are, because they have a psychiatric disorder? Does that mean that they have less memory enhancement over the night of sleep? And it lets us, it's pushing at the boundary conditions always helps you understand the basic science. So from my perspective, I guess I would say yes. A lot of the fascination is, whoa, can we find any schizophrenia patients that have no sleep spindles? That would be, so to me, that would be so cool. Whereas to Dara and to me in my other state, that would be so horrible. So we're doing both of those in patient populations.
Yeah, that's what I suspected. Very cool. Just to reiterate, to make sure that I totally understand, I don't totally understand anything, but I understand Dara's approach. So she would like to cure schizophrenia and autism, and the idea behind attacking this through sleep is that regardless of the underlying etiology of the conditions, one consequence is defective sleep, and fixing pharmacologically or behaviorally, however it's going to work, fixing this defective sleep could ameliorate the other symptoms of the disorders.
Or many of them. So Dara would argue
many of them.
That you use sleep to proceduralize skills that you learn, as with the finger tapping task or the visual discrimination task. You get better at those after you sleep. And in fact, we proceduralize 90% of what we do. No one stepping off a curb says, That's a drop of about 8 centimeters, which means I should back off on stimulation of those motor neurons by 5%. They just look at it and they step down. And there argues that a lot of what we see as more global cognitive deficits in schizophrenia may be because they haven't been able to proceduralize all the rest of it. That, we count on being able to walk, it's the chewing gum and talking, chewing gum and rubbing your stomach at the same time, right? If you can't do that, you're in a lot of trouble. And it's because we proceduralize those. If I told you, God, I know someone who can't recite the alphabet while remembering a 15-digit number, you'd say, well, I can't do that either, Bob. I mean, so there are things that we can proceduralize, which makes it easier for us to do everything else. And so there are things, there might be a cascading effect where a lot of the deficits that are totally wake-related are deficits because a sleep-dependent failure to proceduralize other skills have just taken up so much of our available computing power, if you will, while we're awake, that we can't do much of anything else.
Very, very fascinating. Now, I held you back twice on PTSD. So what is the research that you've done on PTSD? And because I can imagine right away, I mean, that's going to be, it's a very emotionally intense disorder, by definition.
So alas, I've done no research on it. Why haven't I? My wife, who's a trauma therapist, keeps asking me why I haven't. It's because just technically it'd be a stretch for me and would take more resources that I have. And I just didn't feel like I could go there. I try to get other people interested in doing it. But I've published actually a couple of theoretical papers where I've argued that PTSD, in fact, is a sleep disorder. In fact, it's a disorder of sleep-dependent memory processing. And the argument goes something like this. PTSD, first and foremost, is a memory disorder. It's a failure to process a memory the way we normally would. So you're walking home and a car drives by and goes through a puddle and splashes water on you. And you're going out that evening and you don't have a lot of time. And it's what my wife would call a small T trauma. It's upsetting. You get angry, you get upset, and you deal with it. And by the next day, you've pretty much forgotten it and gotten over it. There are other traumas that our brain doesn't seem to be able to put away the same way. That after a month even are just as raw as they were when they first occurred. And when trauma memories failure to go through normal processing, we call it PTSD. It's post-traumatic stress disorder, because a month out, they're still having vivid recall, intrusive recalls of the memory. They're still being avoidant of places or things that might have been associated with the original trauma that no longer should be. And so the question is, why hasn't the brain successfully processed it? And when I talk with Debbie, the first thing that's clear is it's not that people want to forget their traumas. They can say they do and feel like they do, but they actually don't. No one who was raped wants to forget it. That hole would be traumatic in itself. What they want to do is several things. They want to make it so that when they remember it, they don't remember it in all the vivid, gory details of when it first occurred. They want to remember a car came through a stoplight and hit the side of my car and crashed it in. And I saw my husband slump over with a piece of metal sticking through his neck. But they don't remember the color of the other car. They don't remember the music that was on the radio. They don't remember all the details if they've processed it properly. They just have this memory, and the memory still makes them sad and still pains them. but the strength of that memory has been weakened in the emotional sense. So it's stripped away the background. It's reduced the emotional response to it. Both of which are things that we know happen primarily when you're asleep, not when you're awake. And it's done a third thing that sleep is really good for, which is it's taken the memory and integrated it in with other memories in this fictitious excuse me. And it's integrated this memory in with other memories in this person's life, memories of other car accidents, memories of other times with her husband when they had good times together, memories of other sad things that have happened, so that she can put it in perspective. That's really what it's about. She can put it in perspective and now imagine a way to go forward in her life. In a real way, being cured from PTSD more than anything else is about that. It's about putting the memory to rest and being able to see a way forward. And all three of those processes, the weakening of the associated affect, the blurring out of the peripheral images from the memory, the integration with other related memories, all of those things are things we know that happen, are processes that we know occur preferentially while we sleep. So a failure of those sleep-dependent processes would probably be enough to result in what we call PTSD. And if you want to add a piece to that, there's the PTSD dreams. So if I were to talk to you about what dreams are, I would say dreams are about things that happen in our life, but they never are replays of the actual memory. We did a study back in 2000 where we had people identify elements in their dreams that they thought, they were convinced they understood what happened during the day or in their lives that led to that getting incorporated into their dreams. And we had them rate how close those two events were to each other. And it turns out that at most 1 or 2% had the possibility of looking like actual replays in the dream of what had happened during wake. We dream about what happens in our life. We don't dream what happened, with the single exception of PTSD, where people can night after night, week after week, in bad cases, year after year, see the actual traumatic memory replayed during their dreams. And that's probably signaling a breakdown of those processes that normally help people recover from trauma. So to see that memory of the car accident play out in a dream as someone opening a door and falling out of a car and not being hurt, or seeing a car crash where someone else gets hurt or where nobody gets hurt, integrating all of these imagined scenes that we get in our dreams puts the memory of the actual event into perspective, and is part of that process that has to happen if a person is to heal from a seriously traumatic event. And the fact that they can't have those dreams is a sign that they cannot do that healing.
I have found this story that you just told, this theory, very convincing, which is good, even though I'm obviously an outsider. But there were two things that I wanted to ask about. One, just is that first point that you made uncontroversial, that PTSD is at root a memory disorder?
Well, now you get into turf battles, right? For a long time, so PTSD didn't used to exist. I don't know if you are aware of this.
It started with shell shock, right?
It was called shell shock, and it was considered a version of wimping out. Weak character, pull yourself together, man, sort of thing. And it wasn't seen as a serious psychiatric disorder. That only really came, I think, with Vietnam and it came over fights for reimbursement for psychiatric care. And it was a political fight that was taken to Congress. And so it was actually Congress, as I remember the story, who said, yes, there is this thing called PTSD. Yes, it is a medical disorder. Yes, you have a right to medical care for it. So at first, we didn't even think it existed. And then it became, I think at first it was just considered like PTSD. And then it became an anxiety. I think in DSM-4, it was an anxiety disorder. And now I think it has its own category that I can't remember at the moment in DSM-5. So if you push any of these people, they'll say, well, yes, of course, it's a memory disorder. Because that's really all we have from the event. I mean, if you have scars, if you have injuries that didn't heal, physical injuries, you could argue that those are part of the PTSD that aren't just memories. Although I would then push and say, well, you have to remember that those injuries came from the traumatic event for it to contribute to the PTSD. So I think the question is that with the word primarily, a sleep disorder. It's a memory disorder. It's a question of, if you're a memory researcher, yes. If you're an anxiety researcher, maybe no. But everybody will admit when push comes to shove that, yes, it's a failure to either initially form the memory in a proper encoding or else to process it effectively afterwards.
And then the other part of the story that I would like to hear fleshed out, though it might be outside the scope of where you are in your own theorizing, is so this ultra vivid, true to life dreaming signals that something involving memory processing in particular within the brain has been altered, because obviously something's been altered within the brain if you have a disorder like this. But what I would want to know is just what has happened during this traumatic event that is altered in the brain. Like, what does this event do? What does it alter in the brain? And why does it result in these symptoms?
Well, first of all, I'll refer you to my wife, Debbie Corrin's book, Every Memory Deserves Respect. That's the initials EMDR, which is a form of psychotherapy that she uses in her treatment of trauma patients. But the book really goes through both the psychology and the clinical aspects and the neurobiology of trauma. So that's a much better and lay person description of the answer to the question you asked. The basic question that we don't even know the answer to is whether the problem with PTSD is whether in the initial encoding of the memory, something went wrong. So Bessel van der Kolk, who is another very prominent trauma therapist, argues that the memory is not stored as a unified whole, that the individual pieces of it, the sounds, the smells, the visual images, the physical sensations, are all stored scattershot in the brain, which we know on one level they are, but normally when an episodic memory forms, it binds all those pieces together. So when you remember an extremely emotional event, you remember the sounds and the smells and the sights and the emotions and the actions and what happens and the narrative flow of it. With PTSD, people a lot of times cannot tell you what happened. They'll say, it was horrible. I can't describe it. And they actually don't have a story, a narrative that they can tell you. So there might be something that went wrong in the initial encoding of the information. The hippocampus, which normally binds the aspects of a memory together, because you have to appreciate that the visual memory is stored back here and the auditory is stored over here, and the olfactory is stored up here, and all of these parts are stored in different parts of the brain. And the hippocampus takes all of those and binds them together into a unified whole. So it might be, I think Bessel would argue, that the hippocampus is overload and fails to bind them together. And that failure then leads to an inability to do a lot of the types of processing that depend on that hippocampal binding. So that's one model. Another model might be, and I guess I've leaned towards this argument, and I don't have any reason to believe that this one is correct, is that for REM sleep to carry out its types of memory processing, which involve many of these aspects of emotional processing, when REM sleep occurs, the brain shuts off the release of both noradrenaline and serotonin in the brain. They're completely shut down. And somehow this allows the brain, well, we know ways in which shutting down noradrenaline release in the brain allows the brain to access associated memories more easily, as, for example, you would need to do to construct a dream about a traumatic event rather than replay the traumatic event. And we know that people with PTSD, unlike normal controls, release more adrenaline while they're asleep rather than less. So it might be as simple, I hate to use that word, nothing's as simple as I want it to be. It might be as simple as with truly harshly traumatic memories, the brain cannot shut off that release of noradrenaline when they go into REM sleep. And so the brain cannot get into that neurochemical milieu that's required to do this kind of associative processing. And we know that people with PTSD are hypervigilant even while they sleep. So, two different models, either of which could be explanatory. And we're not good at figuring out experiments that would tease those apart. Although there's work with an adrenergic agent called prazosin, a drug that's known to stop those repetitive vertical dreams. So maybe that would argue that it is a problem with the regulation of that noradrenergic system while we sleep.